On this edition of Larry the Golf Guy, we welcome to the show Tripp Davis. Tripp is one of the more notable golf architects working today, although he started his journey in the game as quite a talented junior player. He was a three-time All-American AJGA junior growing up in the Atlanta area. He had a career as a college golfer at the University of Oklahoma, where he was an All-American selection in 1989 and a member of the Sooners' 1989 NCAA championship team. But rather than pursue a career as a player, Tripp got a master's degree in landscape architecture, and over the past 30 plus years, he has carved out quite a notable career as a golf architect. We talked with Tripp about what made him decide to become a golf architect, what his architectural style is, how he compares restoration work, which he does a lot of, to original designs, which he also does, why Golden Age architecture is so popular today, the golf architects he had most admires, and his thoughts on the current period of golf architecture. So all that and more upcoming next with noted golf architect Tripp Davis on this edition of Larry the Golf Guy. Well, welcome to another edition of Larry the Golf Guy, and I'm so pleased today to be joined by one of the notable golf architects working today, Tripp Davis. Tripp, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for making time to chat with us today.
Glad to be here.
And as I often like to do with my guests, to just sort of provide context and kind of where you grew up. I knew you grew up in the Atlanta area, and obviously a very talented golfer, but maybe just tell us how and when did you first get introduced to this great game?
So it's an interesting story, funny story. We were down at my where my parents grew up in Hogansville, Georgia, and I don't remember when it was. I think it was around Thanksgiving, probably. And I was a handful, and so I was 9 or 10, and my mom handed me off to her uncle, who was taking two of his grandkids to play, and so we went out and played at the little Hogansville Golf Club. It was one of those. Um, I'm drawing a blank on the name now, but there was a bunch of golf courses, especially in the Southeast, that were built by one of the fraternal organizations, and most of them were 9 holes, but they were all pretty cool golf courses.
Uh-huh.
And Hogansville Golf Club's still there. And so we played. The bug bit me, and um, I think my mom probably regretted it after that, because I didn't want to do anything but play golf. And I still played some sports and so forth, but for the most part, golf became something I really loved doing. I started playing in the Atlanta Junior Golf Association when I was 11.
Wow.
And one of the funny things was I had seen a lot of the guys on the tour, and they talked a little bit about them going out and charting the golf course. And we were playing these little 9 hole events, and I'd make my mom drive me around so I could and get permission to go out and do a yardage book, or chart the course before a 9 hole event. So that's kind of where I think my interest in golf course design came from. Is I always took the game more strategically than physically. And
Interesting.
so, which helped, because as I got older and was competing, I wasn't as gifted physically. And so learning how to get my way around the golf course was important.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I mean, and you were obviously quite a junior golfer. I mean, I think I saw a three-time AJGA All-American. That's pretty impressive stuff. I'm sure you were pretty heavily recruited. How did you come to decide to go to the University of Oklahoma?
Well, it was, a lot of, if I remember back, I think there was kind of a foregone conclusion that I was going to go to the University of Georgia.
Yeah,
And
I would think Bulldogs, right? Growing up in
yeah.
Georgia.
And my uncle played college basketball. My
Oh, wow.
mom's uncle played at Troy State, I think it was then. and was a basketball coach. My mom played basketball all through, I think, 1 year of college, and she was a basketball coach.
Wow.
And they told me two things, and kind of coached me through two things. One, go to the best athletic department because there's a good chance the coach is going to change, and go somewhere where the support for the program is really, really strong. And then the other was you might not want to hang around all your high school friends, um, and maybe get away from that. And so David Yates was the coach at Oklahoma, and fortunate that he took to recruiting me. And that year we had the year I came in, we had Doug Martin, was the #1 junior in the world. Craig Perks from Australia was considered one of the top 10 juniors in the world, and so we had a good recruiting class. And so I knew going in, and those two had already committed by the time um, I had made a decision. And it was, Georgia Tech was also something I looked at really hard, but
Mhm.
again, I wanted to kind of get away a little bit. Um, and I visited Florida, North Carolina,
Mm.
um, and I went to Lamar actually too. The coach at Lamar was a good recruiter, a guy named Greg Gross, who ended up becoming my coach at Oklahoma
Oh,
after
wow.
the coach left in the middle of my freshman year. And so, but I think it was a good decision for me. Like I said, I wasn't as physically gifted, but it helped me to mature in a lot of ways, not just in golf. Um, and I still live out here. So, my wife's from basically from Oklahoma. She grew up in Southwest Kansas, but all her family's from Oklahoma, and I've lived here for a long time.
Yeah, and it's funny. I mean, you're at Oak Tree, and if I'm remembering right, that's where you won the NCAA championship, I think, if I'm remembering right, in '89, right? And you
Yeah.
guys had, I know, come really close, if I'm remembering the year before. And but talk to me about what '89 was like. I know you were an All-American that year. That sounds like a pretty magical season.
Well, we were actually probably a more highly regarded team my sophomore year. We had Todd Hamilton, who went on to win the British Open. Craig Perks,
Right.
won the Players 1 year. Grant Wake played on tour forever, and then Doug Martin was a Walker Cupper and won. I think he won once on tour and played out there for a long time. And we had a lot of good players. Glenn Day was on that team. My sophomore year, I didn't play nationals because we had 5 All-Americans that year.
Mm.
Uh,
Wow.
and so that was the team that was probably maybe on paper considered better. But my junior year, we were pretty good. And then my senior year, we won, I think, 10 tournaments. We're ranked #1 all year.
Wow.
Won nationals back when it was still stroke play. I think we won by 22.
Oh my.
And so it was a fun. We had a lot of good players. I mean, I was playing three, four, well, actually more like 4 or 5. We had two freshmen that were all world, that were second team All-Americans. Doug Martin was on our team. He was a first team All-American. And then Ricky Bell and I were the other two, and then played nationals, and both of us were All-Americans. And so we had 5 All-Americans my senior year too.
Wow.
But we actually played the East Course at Oak Tree. Uh,
Okay.
I live on what used to be called Oak Tree Golf Club, which is now Oak Tree National. And the East Course at Oak Tree um, back then I think it was top 100 at one point, and a very different type of peat dye from
Okay.
Oak Tree Golf Club, but really, really good. We played the Oklahoma Open has been played there for years,
Hmm.
and I think it's moving around some now, but really good golf course. And but it's kind of funny, we moved up here a couple of years ago after living in Norman for a long time. My in-laws live in Stillwater, which is just up, not very far from here.
Oklahoma State country, right?
Yeah, my wife went to Oklahoma State. My
Okay.
youngest daughter went to Oklahoma State. My oldest went to Oklahoma. But we're not really a house divided because
Okay.
um, I actually have a lot of respect for the school
Yeah.
and for, the golf program.
Golf
And
program, right? With Mike Holder was there all those years. That was a
yeah,
great program, right?
yeah. And I endeared myself to him early on. He didn't recruit me, but, he was, they had a lot of, players there that, he was stacked when I wouldn't have gone there anyway because they were so stacked.
Yeah.
But my freshman year, the first tournament I played in, I was playing with EJ Pfister, and um, EJ has about a 13 and a half shoe. And back then, he was a little overweight, about 5'10 probably. But, we were playing in Florida and it had been raining. And my coach had told me, Coach Yates had said, don't let these guys intimidate you. Well, I didn't have a problem with that. And so EJ hit it down the fairway and he goes up and says, well, my ball is in casual water. And I went over there and I weighed about 140 pounds and my shoe, I have been 9.5. And I stood there and I said, well, EJ, I don't know if this is casual water or not. And he jumped back in there and water's flying around everywhere. And this drew the attention of Coach Holder, who kind of eked over there. And I said, well, EJ, if you weren't so fat, with those big clown shoes, it wouldn't be casual water. But for you, I guess it is. And Holder couldn't help but laugh and walked away. And ever since then, he has treated me with more respect than most of you guys. So we've had a great relationship.
I love it. That's a great story. So you're at Oklahoma. I think you graduated in '90 with a degree in marketing and advertising. Talk to me about, you must have at some point, with as talented as you were, thought about whether you were going to pursue professional golf. Was that what was the decision process like for you, which I assumed is when you were in college, that you were going to head towards architecture rather than, pursue a career as a player?
Well, I did turn pro and played that summer after nationals and did well enough to have a little bit of money to keep trying.
Hmm.
I went to the Hogan Tour School.
All right. So, right.
Um,
That's what it
that
was
was the
called back
first
then.
year
Right.
of 1990 was the first year of the Hogan Tour. And you had two stages. I made it to finals, did well enough to have a little bit of status and played some that year and did okay, but hurt my shoulder, my right shoulder, and started to run out of money. And again, realized physically, these guys are so good and I could hang with them, but I wasn't going to make a living at it. And luckily the, I had, people around me telling me that, um, you can always do something else. And I was fortunate that um, you know, did well in school and did have some other things I could think about. So actually, in the fall of or the summer of '91, when I was about out of money, I um, looked into going to grad school and
Mhm.
found out that because I had been a scholarship athlete, Oklahoma, the university would, or the athletic department would pay for me to go to grad school.
Oh, neat. Okay.
And I paid my tuition and books, and I think I still had to pay for my, you know, housing and all that other stuff. But um, and so in part, it was a way to get out of being destitute. And and then I always had this love for golf course design, and so I went back and got my master's degree in landscape architecture.
Right.
And you could emphasize in one thing, and my emphasis was in civil engineering to learn drainage.
Oh, wow.
Oddly
Okay.
enough, Pete Dye I'd had a chance to talk to him, and he said the three most important things in golf course design are drainage, drainage, and drainage.
Wow.
And so that's what I did when I went back to school.
Cool. So you mentioned get your master's in landscape architecture, I think was in '94. And I think you did some work, I think, for Charles Howard, if I'm remembering. I saw
Mhm.
somewhere in there, but pretty quickly you formed your own firm, right? I mean, at a pretty relatively young age.
Well, it was, at the time, there was we were in a little bit of a boom, in that there was a lot of interest in golf redesign.
Yeah.
And there was a lot, new courses obviously were booming, but um, the state of Oklahoma was getting ready to do three state park golf course projects. And a friend of mine, actually, how I got connected with Charles at one point, but he suggested that maybe we should go after these. And I had a little bit of name recognition from having played at Oklahoma,
Hmm.
and he was well thought of in the architecture community in Oklahoma. Um, and we actually ended up getting two of these things. They were both 9 holes. One was a 9 hole expansion to Nose. One was a new course called Langley up in northeast Oklahoma. And then the other one was an 18-hole course that Randy Heckenkemper got to do. And so I had sent out information. I talked to, a few of the big names, and was going to get an opportunity to go work for them starting, at the very bottom. And that was about the time that AutoCAD was coming on as well.
Hmm.
But I had not learned it in grad school. They didn't teach it to us at the time, and they wanted us to learn that. So a lot of the people I talked to really wanted me to do plant production. And this opportunity came along to do these two state park golf courses. I had no clue what I was doing, but had, some helping hands to get us through it. And both turned out pretty well. And so that kick started me thinking, well, maybe I should form my own company, which I did for tax purposes as much as anything.
Hmm.
And because when we got these two projects, or we were going after these two projects, the architect friend of mine suggested I form a LLC so I could run things through that.
Hmm.
And the two state park projects came along, and then I got another one outside of that, and it just kind of went from there.
And, as you kind of look back on those early days, because, obviously the firm has now been around, gosh, what, more than 30 years. But I mean, what do you think, looking back, were sort of the key milestones? I know I've seen some, uh, read a bit about the Tribute Golf Club in Dallas in 2000, maybe was a key one. And I know, in terms of restoration, the Engineers Country Club on Long Island was one early
Mhm.
one. I mean, but from your standpoint, were those kind of the early key things, or because you've been very successful, what kind of were the key things that got you on the road to success early on?
Well, I was fortunate, one of the reasons I could compete as a golfer without being as physically skilled is that I was tenacious. And so, um, and I wish I wish I could go back and get some of that tenaciousness back. But I just had a mindset that I was going to make it work. And very fortunate, as most people that go on to have a long career in anything, have something lucky come their way. And had an opportunity to do a new course up at Grand Lake that, helped me to sell a little bit. That was one of the things that helped me to get the tribute. Um, and the tribute was the first big project that I'd done. American Golf was going to manage it, and they back then were the management company in the United States. And so that opened some doors, and, just led to me getting to know a lot of people in the industry. And you just put one foot in front of the other, and most any business, but golf business in particular. And so that when that came out, it actually the first year made the Golf Digest Top 100 public list.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so that didn't hurt.
Yeah.
And then I was still playing some competitive golf, probably too much back then. But I was playing in the Anderson Memorial at Wingfoot.
Yeah.
And I'd done a lot of renovation, but really not too much in the way of restoration. I tinkered with one Perry Maxwell course at Muskogee Country Club. So that was my first introduction to historic type restoration. But a friend of mine that was playing in the tournament was sitting a couple tables over from us at lunch talking about how engineers had just gone through some work and it didn't turn out very well. And and that he said something to the effect of golf course architecture is just a sham business. And he saw me sitting over there and knew that that's what I was trying to do. And I think out of guilt or, out of embarrassment, he invited me to go see engineers. And we ended up reworking number 8 and number 9 greens that fall. And that led to a lot of stuff up there, which then led to being able to get more of that restoration type work. And um, the restoration work, especially when you're doing it in the Northeast, it carries a cachet with it that allows you
Right,
to go market at other places. I mean, if you're going down to talk to Northwood Club in Dallas, for example,
right.
and you've worked on some of the courses up in the Northeast that are highly regarded, it really helps. And so the tribute and engineers were the two things that really kind of helped me get spread my tentacles out a little bit.
Got it. And I want to talk a little more about your style and restoration versus original designs. But just before I dive into that with you, I have to say, I mean, you said you played, you kept competitively. I mean, just want to underscore that. I mean, I think I saw something like 15 USGA championships. I know you went to the quarters at the Mid-Am in 2005, I think in 2009. I mean, you're playing still at a pretty elite level while you're doing this whole business. I mean, it's impressive that you really stay that sharp.
But like I was saying, I think I played too much. You know, it was something important to me. I really enjoyed it, and competition was something I'd done. Being competitive and had been something I'd done my whole life, and so and I got to the point where my physical skills got better.
Interesting.
I always had a good short game, been a good putter, and when I started playing some of the amateur events. I won the Oklahoma Amateur in 2000. That got me into the Sunny Hannah.
Hmm.
Um, and Hunter Haas, who is a good friend, um, had won the Porter Cup the year before, but had
Okay.
decided not to go back to play. And he did so like 3 weeks before the tournament. And he happened to mention my name that I just won the Oklahoma Amateur, and maybe you want to plug him in. And they plugged me in, and I finished about sixth or something.
Wow.
So, and then I played well enough at the Sunny Hannah that next year to get invited back, and then the next year I lost it in a playoff. Um, but my physical abilities, I went from probably hitting 9, 10 greens around and getting it up and down and putting well to hitting 13, 14 greens around, still getting it up and down and putting well. But that's I got to the point where and I wasn't very technical either, so it was all feel, which is
Mhm.
one way I think you can keep your game without playing and practicing a lot, is if you have a good feel.
Yeah.
And the problem with having a good feel is if when it goes, it kind of goes. And which is kind of where I've been here the last few years, and um, so I still play in some competitions. I haven't been very competitive, which is aggravating. So, but I love to play the game more now than probably I ever have.
Wow, that's cool. So let's talk about your architectural style. I mean, and maybe just to kind of connect it to what we've been talking about. I mean, were and are an elite player. How would you describe your architectural style, and in particular, the fact that you've been such an elite player? How do you think that influences your style, if at all?
Well, from a stylistic perspective, and I look at what we do, having really three different facets to it. There's style, there's substance, which is how the golf course plays, and then there's the functional aspect of how it functions, how it works, how it's maintained. And um, so, I've really kind of had to learn over the years. And one of the things I did 20 years ago was hire my own shaper, who was somebody I was working with on restoration projects in the Northeast, who happens to be from Southern California. He just happened to be up there working, and he
Hmm.
and I hit it off. And so and he's got a great artistic eye. And then I hired Kyle Downs 2 or 3 years later, who also has a very strong artistic eye. And we've kind of melded all that together to have style and substance. And then I've always been very involved and interested in how the golf course functions, making sure that it's maintainable.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so it's led us to, we do more of a classic style of architecture, where, we've done a little bit of work where we're, over the years where we bring in more of that natural feel to a golf course, but not to the extent that some others do, in part because I found it to not be as sustainable from a maintenance perspective.
Okay.
And so our approach is really more classical. I'd call it clean, and works with the land, and we're very much, we don't want to move a lot of dirt. We try
Mm-hmm.
to, and actually, will purposely not let my shaper and the other shapers we have now um, have a lot of dirt. I want them to have to scrounge a little bit so that
Yeah.
it really ties in more. But I think the main thing I still focus on is how it plays. And I think it's been lost a little bit in architecture circles that it's been a little bit more recently, it's been more about how the golf course looks than how it plays. And which is fine. I mean, it's just a different genre of architecture, but I wish we put more emphasis on how golf courses play. And when you have discussions about golf course architecture, that we focus more on the interesting things about the way the golf courses can play versus the interesting things about how they look. I think both need to be in the conversation,
Yeah.
as as does function and maintainability. But I think we probably bring a little bit more of a perspective of melding all three of those together. And if we have to compromise in any way, shape, or form, it's probably leaning towards making sure the golf course plays well.
Yeah. That makes sense. A lot of sense. I know, you've done a lot of restoration work in addition to original designs. I mean, what sort of particular challenges does restoration work present for you guys versus original designs and just, kind of relative? I mean, you do both, so I'm sure you enjoy them both, but I'm just sort of curious how you compare the two because I'm sure restoration work, you must have to go dig out all the old photos and everything and, kind of almost like a puzzle, right?
Well, restoration is, you can take on a couple of different ways. I mean, you can be literal about it and try to put things back the way they were exactly. Um, and I think that has its place. And I think there's a lot of guys that do really good work that way. Brian Schneider, for example, does exceptional restoration. Gil does a good job of that too. And we tend to stylistically try to put things back, and again, try to make sure that the golf course is going to play well in the modern era, instead
Right. I
of
was going to
being
say with the
very
distance stuff, that's got to be,
right.
you got to take account of that, right? I mean, the bunker
Yeah.
can't be in exactly the same place to have the same challenge that it was 100 years ago, right?
You can, if you can move tees in a reasonable way to keep those things in place, I think it makes sense. But the approach that I take, and it's just simply the approach that I take, is that the golf course architects back then, they tended to be more focused on the play of the game.
Yeah.
It was definitely more about the play of the game, than it was about some of the more stylistics being, they wanted to be unique in a lot of different ways, but Tillinghast, Perry Maxwell, Ross, they were all really focused on the way the game played.
Right.
And so a lot of the stuff that they built, and Pete Dye was that way too, it was all about the way the game played, the style of the golf course, the visual elements contributed to that. And so, you might have a bunker that's only 200 yards off the back tee. Um, that doesn't necessarily mean that Ross, meant for it to be physically in play. It might have been that he wanted it to catch your eye in some way. And Pete Dye does that, really well. Um, and so you have to pay attention to some of that. but I also think that you have to make sure that the golf course is going to have the same design intent
Right.
to the greatest extent possible. And so, and we're in a really strange period of time right now where, players are hitting it quite a bit further. That all happened in 01, 02 when the Pro V1 came out, kind of
Right.
exasperated a little bit with the Pro V1X, and it stabilized for a while. And now we're starting to see it kind of eke up again, over the last, handful of years. And I think there's also a mindset that everybody hits it on the PGA Tour. Everybody can hit it 340, and they can't. And so I think we've stretched golf courses maybe too far. And what we've done in doing that is we've left behind some of the type of players that played a more rounded game, a more
Yeah.
well-rounded game. We don't have you don't see too many golf courses that would favor a Corey Pavin or a Justin Leonard or Gene Littler type player anymore. And I think that's a shame. I think as a part of restoration, for example, we need to think about how we're going to keep the golf course with the same sort of balance that it really had back then. Not just try to challenge the longest players. And so the restoration elements, there's more about how you're going to change things. With new golf courses, it's about how you're going to put things in. And so one is a reactionary type of mindset. The other is going to be more um, creative, is one way of putting it. The other is just being aware of the type of play you're creating.
Right.
And because you're the one creating the play when you're doing a new golf course. And we went so long in our business, really from 08, 09 until here recently, there wasn't a lot of new golf course work being done. And it really kind of went to the same, small group of guys. And the rows that we just are finishing up in Athens, Georgia, is the first truly new 18-hole golf course that I've done in 15 years.
Wow.
And I've done some new course work, and some of the renovation we've done has been basically rebuilding something, so it was
Yeah.
more new. But when you have to route a golf course, that takes on a different scale than rebuilding one, and the routing becomes everything, and making sure that it works. So that's one of the main differences between restoration and a new course, is you've got to nail the routing on a new course, whereas with renovation restoration, you need to keep an eye on how you could tweak things with the current routing to make it better. But especially with restoration, it's really more about working with what's there. There's a lot more moving parts on new courses.
Yeah.
Uh,
That makes sense.
and I learned that this last year again, that I ended up spending a significant amount of time at the Rose in Athens. There was, I think, one stretch, the longest stretch I was there, and again, I had, we have two or three other projects going. At one point, we didn't have anything else under construction. I spent 21 straight days at the Rose.
Oh, wow.
And I needed to. There's just a lot more moving around, and so um, those are the big differences.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Just on the restoration stuff, I mean, the golden age architecture seems to really be having a moment these days. I mean, when I'm a little older than you, but I mean, when I grew up, it was all Robert Trent Jones and these massively long tees and
Mhm.
and now, Firestone's kind of a classic, example of that and watching the CBS Golf Classic all those years growing up on Firestone and the World Series of Golf. But you look over the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years, I mean, you mentioned Gil Hanse. I mean, people like that doing all this restoration work of these classic courses, which now seem to have such appeal. I mean, you see that even in the rank, you mentioned rankings, like the Golf Digest rankings, the classic courses are so even much more dominant than they were, if you looked at those rankings 20 years ago. What is it, do you think, about those classic courses that, at least in the moment we're going through, have such great appeal and and maybe that some new courses haven't had that so features. But what features in those classic courses do you think have such appeal that have made it such a thing to restore all these golden age classics?
Well, I think one of the things that's raised a lot of attention towards those classic golf courses, and you can, especially the ones that came out in the 20s and late teens of
Yeah,
19 teens and 1920s. Um, One of the things that really has drawn a lot of appeal to those is the story they tell. We live in a marketing world,
yeah,
and they definitely create a story that is unique, that makes it hard to, as a new golf course, you're having to compete against history. And everybody that's been involved in renovation, restoration work, and the media and so forth, I think have really helped these older golf courses to regain attention. And again, I go back to, I think one of the things that's unique about them is the high level of interest in the way the game was played. Um, and when I use the word interest in how it played, it made you think. It gave you options. There was a lot of different types of shots you could play and had to play.
yeah,
And so, from a purely playing perspective and how the golf course, how the game's played, that style of architecture or that type of architecture had a lot more interest than when we got to the point of maybe mass producing golf courses for a period of time,
right.
because the older golf courses are just replete with detail, and all the little details matter. And so, from the way a ball bounces at the front of the green to the way it rolls out in fairways and it rolls out on greens, the way that a bunker is positioned visually and physically, these are all details that they took more time maybe to perfect in the
Yeah,
20s back then in that golden age of architecture. And and I think those of us doing restorations, at that level are paying attention to those details.
yeah,
And so, it's bringing back a type of way that the game is played as much as the way that it looked.
yeah,
Uh, that is really made it more interesting for players, and you couple that with the way that the story is told, it's become really interesting. And a lot of people have taken a lot of more interest in it. You're right. I mean, if Fazio came out with a new golf course in the 1980s, 90s, it was in the top 100.
right. Exactly,
And
exactly.
um, and maybe rightfully so in some respects, but over the period of time, your older golf courses have started to kind of come back in and fill some of those places, and
Yeah,
some of those courses done in the 80s and 90s. And I think there's a little bit of a a negative, perception that's been placed on some of Robert Trent Jones Sr. And they were great golf courses. I mean, one of the best golf courses I've ever played is Point Oak Woods up in. I played the Western Am there,
yeah. Western, right.
and it's not Golden Age. It's more penal than it is strategically interesting, but it still was great golf. And it was interesting in a way that, if you played the right shot, skill was rewarded.
Yeah,
Um, and, um, and I think that's going back to the great old golf courses, even though they may be really difficult, and there's a lot of quirks you have to deal with. You had to learn the golf course to know the type of shots to play, and skill was rewarded.
right.
And and I think that's really important. And I think that's one of the reasons they've kind of reemerged.
Yeah, I agree with all that. We're kind of fortunate here in LA. We've got a couple of George Thomas gems and Riviera and the North Course at LACC. You were talking about options and different ways to play holes. And I mean, 10 at Riviera is one of my favorite holes I've ever played. And the different ways to sort of play it, or some of the ones at LACC, even some of these, Like 7 at LACC when they had the Walker Cup there. Sometimes the tees are all the way back. It's like 280, then or
Mhm.
it's 200, or it's just a lot of different strategy and stuff. And it's you really appreciate that. Playing those kind of courses. Let me ask you one other thing. Just in terms, we touched on this a little bit, but and I'm particularly interested to get your thoughts on this because of your being an elite player as well as a noted golf architect, and that's the impact of equipment on the game. You mentioned, the Pro V1, and I, again, a little older than you, not too much older, but go back to the days of the persimmon drivers and the old balls, and man, I mean, it's not just distance, but I mean the spinning, and you could, I remember it was never at your level, but playing, regional tournaments in New England. I mean, you could snap hook that driver, like nothing, and it's funny. Colin Montgomery just posted yesterday. I saw online the driver he used, when he was young versus what the 460cc looked. You should see them next to each other, and it's just,
Mhm.
again, I mean, the ball obviously is designed to be married to the club head, but having that huge a club head and and people being able to hit the ball, I think, as far as they do, not just because they're great athletes, but because the margin for error with these club heads is, the driver is so much bigger than it used to be with that old persimmon stuff. I mean, how do you sort of, I guess maybe two different questions here. How do you sort of see that having affected, the game and golf cart architecture, and particularly when you think of its impact on some of the classic cathedrals of the game, what would you like to see, if anything, done going forward in regulating this equipment?
Well, first I'll say that um, I don't think enough attention gets paid at times to the fact that the golf courses are so much more, or they're maintained in such a better way,
Yeah, that's fair.
um, more consistent way. Some people might not like the word better, but that your equipment, um, and especially with the equipment being more consistent. It used to be that, I think it was 1981 they played the US Open at Marion. And if I
Right.
remember, I read something where the fairways were mown at 1 inch. And, the fairways at Marion for the last Open they played there were probably almost a quarter of an inch. And so you have a lot more control over your ball in some respects, when you're playing off that type of, when that variance, because at 1.5 inches today, rough's tall enough to create some problems with being able to spin the ball.
Right.
Even a step cut at 1 inch, if it's maintained at 1 inch, is enough to create some challenges with being able to control the ball. So you played a different game because you had to consider more margin for error, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
Um, and so, Nicholas used to always talk about, he would normally hit the ball to the middle of the greens. And he was playing a game where par meant something.
Right.
And um, and one of the things that, today the golf ball, not only because the equipment and the ball itself and players today, when I go up to the range at Oak Tree and there's a few of the really good players there, they're 6'3", 6'4", they're athletes and so they hit it a lot further. But when the ball lands on fairways today, we're always talking about firm and fast. And if you remember the opens that Nicholas played in, one of the reasons he hit the big high cut is because the fairways were soft.
Right.
It's pretty well stopped where it landed, and so he hit this big high cut, and he hit a lot of fairways that way. Um, but if you can, so if you can hit it down a fairway and it's firm and fast, and there's really not much in your way, that's why they're hitting at 340, 350, because the ball is running out further than it used to because of the consistency of the conditions and the greater ability to predictably manage conditions. A few weeks ago at Pebble Beach, they got some rain at the first of the week, and those greens are such that they don't have as much control over drawing them down as you might like at Augusta. And so the golf course got a lot easier because of that. Um, so it's you know, that's a question you could write, or that conversation you could write a big book about. But I think, when you generalize things a lot, Larry, I think the one thing that I'd like to see the game go back to is to design in such a way that par means something,
Yeah.
and that we're not necessarily trying to get players to, we're not penalizing players um, for playing a bad shot as much as we are challenging the aggressive plays. And penal design kind of took over for a long time.
Yeah.
Where, you really were challenged for hitting a poor shot, and length and the conditions and the equipment you were playing with mitigated a lot of things to where par still meant something, but you really, you were penalized for a poor shot, not so much challenged for hitting a really good aggressive shot.
Yeah.
Um, um, and so I think that's what I'd like to see the game go back to more, is designing in such a way that we give more players the ability to compete in the field, which then translates to more players that play the course every day, having the ability to get around. One of the things that Pete Dye did really well that I think needs to be more involved in the game going forward is to really challenge the aggressive play with small margins for error, but give yourself plenty of, give players room to play conservatively. But that conservative option doesn't lead to an open shot for the next one you can be more aggressive with. It tends to lead to a shot you got to be conservative with again. Um, and I mean, there's so many different elements that go into it, but I, I think as much as anything, I think architecture plays a role in that, because the players want to play what's going to give them the best ability to play the golf course as well. Manufacturers are going to follow suit with that. And so, you could make an argument, and I'm not necessarily going to make the argument completely, but that architecture can drive that. If we played Colonial, or, um, Harbor
I was
Town,
going to say Harbor Town when you mentioned Pete. Yeah.
Harbor Town, even TPC Sawgrass, is not ultra long. And if we played that type of golf all the time on tour, they would want to spin the ball more. They would want to hit it straighter. They would want to be able to work the ball more. Um, and and you could get to a point where the shorter players, and when I say shorter, I don't necessarily mean really short, but you know, um, get it to where more players have the ability to compete.
Right.
And that's kind of becoming more of a theme. I actually heard Sam Saunders talk about it on the uh, telecast this weekend, about some of the changes they made to Bay Hill were in an attempt to make the golf course less about power and a little bit more about thinking and being precise and playing, and getting the ball in the hole. They've made a concerted effort, and I don't know to what extent they did or could, but to make the golf course less about power and more about having a well-rounded game. Now, to the equipment and regulation and so forth, um, I think that's a tough one, because I again go back to the architecture, and that um, slowing the ball down. From what I'm hearing, it's going to slow it down a little bit, but it's not really going to. Rory, for example, instead of standing up and popping one 350, it may only go 335 now.
Yeah, it's not a big difference. I agree from what I've seen.
And I think the move with the grooves was helpful when we went away from the square groove to some extent, because if you want to go back and trace a lot of where all this started to snowball, it was with the square groove. I mean, I remember watching actually the course that I played EJ Fister with EJ Fister, where he hit it in the casual water. That golf course was played on tour, and either that year or the year after, it was probably a couple years later, Mark Calcavecchia coming down the stretch, hit it in the rough on a couple of holes coming in and was able to hit wedges out of the rough, or not even wedges, maybe. It might have been more than that.
Oh yeah, so it's
Ball
so
landed on the
yeah,
green and
I'll
stopped
at
it.
the, right. That's a famous. I couldn't agree with you more. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was, I think it was the old Honda Classic, and he's
Yeah.
got an eight
Mhm.
iron. I want to say, I don't know if it was Eagle Tracer before then, but I mean,
Eagle Trace, because that's
it
where we
was like
played
he
that
hits an
college
eight
ball.
iron out of the rough, and Nicholas, as he often does for that tournament, he was in the booth. And and he was in the booth again with Hicks and those guys this weekend, at the tournament that was down in Palm, or not this weekend, the weekend before. But anyways, Calcavecchi gets up there, and I want to say it was like 15 or 16. I mean, I'm stretching my memory here, and he hits an eight iron with his ping eye two square grooves. And the thing is, and it's in spinach. He's in deep rough, and it hits it and hits the green and stops. And Nicholas says, that's square grooves. And that was a big, you totally agree with you. That was like a seismic moment for the groove stuff.
Well, and and what that led to is, well, I don't have to hit it straight anymore, and I'm gonna get it closer out of the rough than I am with a wedge than I am the fairway with a 6 iron. And so, that led to the bomb and gouge era.
Right.
And uh, frankly, I'm not sure we've ever left that era.
I don't think we
Um,
have, based on what Bryson does. I don't think we have.
yeah, I mean, so things always change and they always evolve. I think architecture can play a role in getting players to play the game in a way that we want, that isn't necessarily where the golf courses are all about length. And one
Right.
of the first things we can do is not lengthen the golf courses to the extent that some of them have been lengthened. You know, it's not that you're not then protecting the golf course from the longer players. It's that you're giving the rest of the field some chance.
Right.
Yeah. Justin Leonard and I did a golf course. We did two golf courses together at one point. One was a victim of the '08 crisis, and then the other one was called Old American in Dallas. And so we spent a lot of time together. And that was about the time that that golf courses were getting too long for him.
Yeah.
And and it diminished this, the ability to play skillful shots from one of the best players that's ever played the game. And so whatever they do, and I have all the respect in the world for the RNA and the USGA and what they're trying to do, and I have all the respect in the world for the manufacturers, because the amount of research they put into trying to make the game better. But I think one role that we as architects have that to play or can play is to design golf courses, redesign golf courses, bring back architecture that makes the players want to play the game in a more precise, more thoughtful way.
Yeah. No, I agree with all that. That's well said. I got to ask you one thing, just because I know you're such a great student of the game. Who, you can do it past or present. Who are the golf architects? If you're going to name three or four that you have, whether they're working today or were 100 years ago, that you have the most respect for, you think the highest of.
Um, Probably, I've learned the most from, in studying their work, and um, whether you like Pete Dye's style or not. I mean, the substance of his golf courses and the way that they created interesting ways to play the game was phenomenal. And so, that's one person. If you break down, you strip away all the noise, as he called it.
Right. Right.
And he used the noise to make his golf courses look more difficult at times than they really were
Right.
physically. Which if you can make a golf course look more difficult, it gets into your mind and eventually makes it more difficult physically. But he's definitely one. Perry Maxwell, because I've spent so much time in Oklahoma. Um, I've been exposed to a lot of his work. And when I started playing the University of Oklahoma golf course, the greens were still Maxwell greens.
Oh, wow.
And one of the things I've learned from him is that you don't have to get real wild and woolly with a green, even though he built some that were kind of wild and woolly. But that he would move water off the greens in so many different directions that what it did when you got to the interior portion of the green is it created a lot of interesting movement without having to be too severe. He was also exceptional, and Pete Dye was also very good at this, and and painting the edges of his greens with hole locations. And by that I mean within 9 to 10 feet from the edge of most every Maxwell green that you ever see, there's a place to put a pin. And he bunkered his golf course as well. He thought of, even though he wasn't a great player, he understood what was going to challenge players. And that was angles, and angles are only really as important as how well you can protect that angle, and how difficult you can make it to get to that
Right.
location. And because of the way his greens moved, when you got into the interior portion of his greens and you were putting back to the edges, the ball usually changed speed, and it changed direction of slope,
Wow.
uh, and or to change the degree of slope. So his greens were always really a challenge, and are really a challenge to match up line and speed. Now with greens getting so much faster, you don't need quite as much of that to do the same thing. And in some cases, you need to tone it down a little bit so that that's still in play.
Right.
Um, but he's won. Tillinghast, I played a lot of tournament golf over the years on Tillinghast courses. And
Yeah. Yeah.
the one
You
thing
mentioned
that
the
really,
Anderson Wingfoot, so I know you've experienced those screens.
Sonny Hanna,
Yeah.
and if I understand correctly, the greens at Sonny Hanna, even today, there's still a number of them that are pretty much the way they, originally meant to be. Spring Lake in New Jersey that we work with was originally George Thomas routing. Tillinghast came in 1918 and rebuilt everything. And those greens are, with the exception of a few that have been changed, and I've tweaked a few of them, are very much old Tillinghast. And the same thing applies. Tillinghast did it a little bit differently with more pitch, and then movement in the green. Um, and then William Flynn's definitely
Yeah.
someone, especially more lately, that's really influenced me. We're working on Turtle Creek down in Jupiter, Florida,
Okay.
hopefully
Yeah.
here in 2028. And that's a Joe Lee design. But Joe worked for Dick Wilson, who worked for Flynn, and there's a lot of commonality in what you see in the architecture. Bigger slopes, a little bit broader movement, but same applies. Make it a challenge to match up line and speed. So um, I haven't been able to get around and see as much of the newer guys as, I played some Sand Hills. I played a handful of times that I just love. I think the interest in playing that golf course is exceptional. Um, I'm not a I'm not opposed to the greater amount of width we see today than you used to see. Most of the golf courses, when you think of a Flynn or a Tillinghast or a Maxwell, they were largely Parkland style golf courses. And even if they were on more of a more naturalistic site, the features of design and the way the golf course played still tended to have more of that Parkland feel to it.
Right.
Um, but and they were tight. It wasn't Maxwell did a little bit more than maybe the other guys, but um, the width on golf courses, I think, done well. And I think some of the golf courses that Maxwell and Flynn and Tillinghast did got narrower over time, especially when we brought rough in.
Right.
Um, uh, I think sometimes we can get a little bit too wide with fairways, and we can do a little bit too little with angles in the greens and too much with the contours in the greens, to where it becomes a little bit more of a hit as far as you can and then have good distance control into the greens. But um, but Bill and Ben at Sand Hills, you can't overpower that golf course. Um, and I love that. I'm actually playing Friday at Cuskawilla,
Okay.
in Georgia. And I saw it 25 plus years ago, and I'm really excited to play that.
Awesome. Well, listen, I'll get you out of here on this. Just you mentioned the Rose back to Georgia. So I know that's you talked about that's taken up a lot of your time. Where does that project stand at the moment?
So everything's grassed. We had a really difficult weather year last year, and Jimmy Humpston, the superintendent there, who's really good and smart, came up with the idea because we were racing to try to get the greens sprigged. The intent is to have Bermuda greens there, and um, we were racing to try to get the greens done to the point where that was one of the reasons I was there for 21 days in a row. But we were going so fast that there was a big concern about being able to keep quality. And he came to me one day and said, "What would you think about just seeding these greens to bent in October, slowing everything down
Mm-hmm.
and making sure we build everything really well? And then we can go back in." We were going to close this coming summer for a period of time anyway. The intent was to try to open it for some member play and then close in late June and then open it again probably September. And he came to me and I said, "That sounds great to me. Let's take that to Nick and Dimitri Cassini, the two guys that founded the club." And they were all on board. And that was probably the biggest thing that happened to help the project make sure we got all the quality in that we wanted instead of running around trying to just get it done.
Right.
And so the greens, uh, you might think, well, so the members are going to start playing the 25th. And I'm actually leaving tomorrow to go paint fairway lines for mow lines. And they'll start playing the 25th, close down, I think the week after Father's Day, and then open again sometime in September. But we're going to convert the greens back to Bermuda. I mean, we're going to, and in a wild sort of way, it's actually not a bad thing. I'm sure you've heard of playing on Bermuda greens that are new and they're really firm, and the golf course is can not play the way you want it to initially because of how firm the greens are. Well, when you sprig Bermuda into bent grass, which is called a no-till conversion, which gets done around the country a lot, you're sprigging into some organic so that it'll help to grow in, and also when you open, the greens won't be quite as firm. And so that's a happy accident as well. Um, but everything, the project was difficult because of weather and speed and everything else. But at the end of the day, it's been an unbelievable experience.
Well, listen, we'll look forward to all that happening. And I want to thank you. This has been terrific, really fun conversation about golf architecture and continued success with everything, with not just the Rose, but all your other matters. And look forward to seeing your future work.
Thanks, Larry. Take care.
Appreciate it. Yeah.